My name's Courtney. I'm the Peer Learning Manager at Soils for Life. Thanks for jumping on for our second round of Cropping Convos. Today we've got the lovely Jade Killoran here to talk multi-species with you. And we've got 3 other Cropping Convos coming up at the end of this week and Monday next week. So we'd love to see you come along for those as well. Just quickly before we hand over the mic to Jade, a little bit about Soils for Life. We're all about supporting Australian farmers to regenerate soils for resilient businesses, landscapes, and communities. And we do this through events like these Cropping Convos, but also through case studies and peer discussion groups and sharing resources online and different events and things. So please stay in touch with us via our newsletter if you'd like to stay in the loop. This Cropping Convo series is part of our Cropping Resilience project, which is all about supporting grain growers. It's a very practice-oriented project, which is why we've got people like Jade coming on to talk to you about the practicalities of implementing different cropping practices that will help to build soil health and farm resilience. And it's funded by the Future Drought Fund. Housekeeping, Jade will present for 10 to 15 minutes. It would be really helpful if you could stay on mute until question time. But please ask any questions in the chat and we'll get through the questions in order via the chat, and you can come off mute if it's a complex question and you'd like to talk it out. But please be mindful of allowing everyone a chance to speak. And we're going to try really hard to stick to time. So forgive us if we have to cut the convo short. All right, I'll hand it over to Jade. This is the second time Jade's been on with us for the Cropping Convo. We had some really great feedback. Jade's from Victoria, so a lot of Victorian experience, but I think some of the principles apply across Australia, so I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it. Yeah, thank you, Jade. I'll hand it over to you now. Get you to share.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Now you should be able to share.
Lovely. How's that? Can you all see that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so we'll just have a chat today about multi-species crops and pastures. So as Courtney said, I work mainly in Victoria, in the high rainfall and medium rainfall zones, sort of central Victoria and south. And for the last 5 years or so, I've been quite lucky in being able to work as an independent advisor, mostly through land care networks to farmers, to do demonstrations and projects about whether multi-species work, you know, commercially on big farms, whether they're economically viable, so whether they stack up next to a conventional farming system, what changes are possible, and that's from a soil health and an economic perspective, and how long do those changes take. So I'll run you through some of those results, some of the broader Australian results, particularly with the cropping focus, and then we'll talk about how you might implement them on farm. So I guess one of the key tenets we'll go through first is that ground cover is really crucial, but diversity is definitely best. So if we have a fallow in our cropping rotation, or we have ground cover which is low or non-existent for some reason, we see a lot of negative soil health outcomes. So an increase in weed pressure, loss of carbon, an increase in compaction, and then that leads to reduced moisture infiltration and reduced nutrient and moisture availability back to the plants. So we really want to take out, if we can, those times of the year when we have low or no ground cover. If we step up into a monoculture system to give us some ground cover, that's okay, but they need constant intervention by farmers. So they're not resilient and they're not a self-organising system, the monocultures or the very low diversity systems. In comparison, the multi-species are much more resilient and they're a much more complete system. So they need a lot less intervention by us and a lot less inputs. So the slide or the picture on this slide is just an example of that. This is actually taken from Dr. Christine Jones. Thank you, Christine. And this is just a little set of pots for species ID from a farmer. And then just for fun, the farmer put all the seeds into the pot as he was going to see them on farm in his multi-species mix. And you can just see the difference there between the two. So there's obviously some chlorosis and some plants on the right-hand side looking quite sick. And then in the mix, they're just absolutely thriving. So that's what we want to duplicate on farm at a larger scale. And the reason it works so well is because of the power of photosynthesis. So we are, at the end of the day, all light farmers. And again, the wonderful Dr. Christine Jones has termed this process the liquid carbon pathway. And what it really boils down to is that plants feed soil biology, and in return, the soil biology feed plants. So that is through this liquid carbon pathway process. And it roughly boils down to CO2 fixed through the photosynthetic process. But some of that, a certain percentage of that, scientists at the moment are saying about 40%, is pumped out into the soil through carbon-rich root exudates. And the plant barters these root exudates as food for soil biology, and in return, the soil biology bring the plant back nutrients and moisture. And it's a really positive feedback loop, and it has a snowball effect. As the plant photosynthesizes more effectively, there's more root exudates pumped into the system, the biology become more active, they push more nutrients and moisture back to the plant becomes more healthy, the plant photosynthesizes better, and so on and so forth. So we really want to foster that relationship between the soil biology and the plants. And one of the ways that we can really do that is by adding diversity to the system. Number one, because it increases the diversity of soil biology, because the different plants activate different aspects of soil biology, but it also means that we have living roots in the system pumping these exudates into the soil for a longer period of the year than we would otherwise have with a lower diversity system. While that's all going on, the biology also help us aggregate soil. So particularly our mycorrhizal fungi, they exude a substance called glomalin or glomalin, depending on how you pronounce it. And this helps us to improve the structure of the soil. It's a really sticky sort of soil glue. So that helps the aeration and the stability of the soil. And then we can store and cycle carbon, moisture, and nutrients back to the plant. So particularly the nutrient availability and the cycling, a lot of nutrients are made plant available by biology. So if we don't have that soil biology and plant interaction happening, we lose the ability to supply nutrients back to the plant. So it's really important from a structure, carbon, moisture, and nutrient perspective that we really keep this liquid carbon pathway open and active for as much of the year as we can. So in terms of putting together a multi-species mix, it's relatively easy. There are readily available made-up mixes that seed suppliers have put together that would be hopefully locally relevant to you wherever you may be. So contact your local seed suppliers to see whether they have mixes. But a way for you to check whether that mix is going to work with your regionally specific species is to make sure that they're ticking off these 4 main plant groups to make sure you have functional diversity in the mix. So number 1 is grasses, anything in the Poaceae family. The second is legumes. They're in no particular order of preference. The second is legumes, anything in the Fabaceae family. And then these 2 third and fourth groups are more groups than specific plant families because they cover off on quite a few plant families. So anything that is a tall broadleaf or a short broadleaf. So as long as you look at your mix and you can see 1 to 3 species of each of those broad groups in the mix, and they look like plant species that will do well in your area, or you know they'll do well in your area, they're familiar to you, that should be a good way to start your multi-species journey. In terms of diversity, 4 is a bare minimum. I usually like to start off with sort of 8 to 15 species in annual mixes. Annuals first, usually because we're going into a somewhat degraded area, paddock, farm, etc. So the annuals help us to alleviate any constraints we may have and get the soil primed and active. And then if suitable, we can move to perennials a little later. So that's anywhere from 6 months to 3 or 4 years after we start the process, depending on how the soil responds. And if we are talking to our local seed suppliers, bare seed if at all possible. So no chemical treatments on the seed. That will just make sure that we're not having any negative impact on our soil biology. However, if you do want to treat the seed with a biological stimulant, that will give you a lot of bang for your buck in terms of a return on investment. So a lot of the biological stimulants go on at 5 to 10 litres to the tonne of seed. So it's a very cost-effective way to get a little bit of nutrition around the seed and improve its germination and establishment. So some of those biological stimulants could be a compost extract, fish hydrolysate, a worm juice, a kelp solution. Those sorts of products would be very useful for going onto the seed. In terms of what to look for, if you've sown a multi-species mix, you can pop an object of known size into the paddock and take some photos just to benchmark the amount of growth that you have, and you could compare that to a conventional area where you haven't popped a multi-species in. So that's my hat in the corner there. This is a multi-species mix in southwest Victoria a few weeks ago. The hoop in the background is me just doing some dry matter cuts. So regardless of what object you use, if you know the size of it, you can just benchmark the above ground biomass or yield quite quickly by taking some photos. If you're looking to see what's going on below ground, two of the more important things to watch for is how aggregated your soil is becoming and whether you have these soil riser sheaths starting to happen around your root system. So we don't want to see any white roots. So this picture in the middle with the roots down the bottom of the picture is showing that there's soil clinging to the roots, and that's a fantastic sign that there's biological activity happening. So we really want to see this nice crumbly texture starting to happen in our soils, and definitely those riser sheaths of soil clinging to the roots as well. If we have legumes in the mix, which I'd highly recommend, we want to check their nodulation. So this is a big one in terms of essentially free nitrogen into the system. So we want to check that our legume roots have nodules, little white nodules there that you can see on the roots. This is vetch. And when we're in the growing season, probably 3 to 4 months after sowing, if we break open those nodules, we want to see them nice and pink inside. So these are just some of the things, or some of the most important things I check for when we're out looking at a multi-species mix. In terms of some of the results that have come through, there's been quite a lot of work done in this space over the last 4 or 5 years as sort of government funding has come online, which is really fantastic. So across the agricultural sector, everyone has had a go, which is great. So in terms of cropping and mixed farms, the Vic No-Till Farmers Association has done a lot of work in this space, as has the South Australia No-Till Association. AgX Alliance has done a really good project that the paper's available on the web. CSIRO are having a look at cropping systems, and AgVic as well. So there's been quite a bit of work in this space. Southern Cross Uni also is doing a bit of work in cropping and mixed farms. In the Hort space, Soil Wealth and that program is doing a lot of work across Australia. And livestock farms, there's a lot of grassroots, pardon the pun, work going on, mainly through Landcare and CMA groups for livestock farms. And also there's a lot of Soils for Life case studies that are available too. So there's quite a bit of work going on across Victoria, which I'm lucky enough to be involved in, but also interstate as well. And a lot of these trials and projects and demonstrations are coming up with similar results and similar positive results, which is really good. So improvements in ground cover, soil structure, soil carbon levels, nutrient cycling, particularly the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus, the yield either of crop or fodder, resilience to stress from the plants, and that can be something like frost or drought or pests or diseases, a reduction in inputs, so particularly in terms of fertilizers and herbicides, and an associated increase in the amount of profitability in the enterprise as well, in terms of being able to reduce inputs. So not all of the trials and demonstrations have shown every single one of these benefits, but there's enough of a trend across the ag sector and across Australia that we can be quite confident that these benefits are going to occur and that they'll be repeatable regardless of the enterprise or the location of that enterprise. So really encouraging to see this sort of overwhelming evidence starting to occur over the last 4 or 5 years. Narrowing down into some of the cropping results that I mentioned on the previous slide, the AgX Alliance project was called Mixed Cover Crops for Sustainable Farming, and that report is available on their website. It's a pretty good read. In terms of results, the yield and organic carbon in southeastern Australian high rainfall zones improved in the following crop after a summer multi-species was put in compared to a fallow. They're recommending autumn and summer multi-species for medium rainfall zones and autumn multi-species first to start for low rainfall zones, but they're confident of having pretty good benefits in each of those sectors. In terms of intercropping, the CSIRO are doing or have done a meta-analysis, and they're suggesting that there's a 50% yield improvement in intercropping a legume in with canola in particular. And AgVic are also doing this in Victoria. So they've had a 3-year trial with 3 sites, and their Rutherglen trial site, which is about a 580 mil annual rainfall, is suggesting that Piola or Beanola could increase profitability and yield. So there's some good results from intercropping as well. If we put livestock into our cropping systems and we go to a mixed farm approach, that grazing makes the multi-species immediately economically viable because of the value of that grazing for the livestock. So in terms of quantity, but also quality. So this is just a list of a couple of farmers, some of them, well, all of them really, very, very good farmers and very well known across Australia. So Tom Briggs, part of the Vic No-Till, Grant Sims, from Down Under Covers, but also closely affiliated with Vic No-Till. Tom Robertson in South Australia in a lower rainfall zone, very heavily involved with the SA No-Till as well. And obviously Cole Seiss, the father of pasture cropping. So they've all had integrated, obviously, multi-species into their livestock and cropping systems. And they're seeing really good productivity and profitability results, but also soil health improvements as well. So accumulating those soil health benefits while the livestock are providing the economic return. So we're de-risking adding multi-species into the system if we have livestock in the system too, because of that production and profitability that we can have from the livestock. So it's in essence sort of having our cake and eating it too, using the livestock to take the risk out of it while we accumulate those soil health benefits as well. So a win-win for us if we have livestock in the system. In terms of putting multi-species into a mixed farm or a cropping system, there are a few different ways to do it. So in autumn, you could take your worst cropping paddocks out of the rotation and put them into a pasture phase. You could companion crop. So there's a few farmers down my way that are putting mainly cereals in as the main cash crop, and then sprinkling in some broadleaves, some legumes and some brassicas usually, and then either taking them out through grazing or using a selective herbicide at a certain point in the season, and then continuing the cereal crop through to harvest. Intercropping, as we've seen, is quite popular and proving quite beneficial. So legume canola is the most used, but also legume cereal is possible too. And if you have livestock in the system and you have some paddocks in pasture, you could diversify a pasture quite easily just by adding a few more species. Spring is feasible if we get the mixes in early enough to get into some spring moisture. Summer, really anywhere you are, is opportunistic. So it depends very much on the soil moisture profile and what the forecast is and how much moisture you may need for the following crop or pasture. So the advice for these later crops and pastures is to use early maturity paddocks. So whether that be a grazing paddock or a grain paddock, and terminate those spring or summer multi-species mixes if you feel that's necessary, while maintaining the cover. So the Vic No-Till farmers in lower rainfall zones often do this if they fear that the summer multi-species is using a bit too much moisture. They'll terminate it and roll it down potentially, or leave it standing to create that ground cover and that soil protection. So one thing I will harp on a little bit is the establishment. So inadequate prep is the main cause of failure of the multi-species. I've been doing paddock scale trials for 5 years, but involved in this multi-species space for about 10 years. So I've seen a lot of paddocks over that time, and the main cause of failure is if we go too easy in terms of establishment. So usually strategic chemical or cultivation is needed in the majority of cases, while aiming to reduce that intervention level over time. But we need to, particularly if we're starting off fresh, earn the right to wean off inputs, and that's both fert and chemical control as well, or cultivation, depending which way you go. So we'll just see some examples quickly. This is in the southwest of Victoria, a perennial ryegrass pasture that hadn't been renovated for a while, and we sowed directly into these paddocks as part of a Landcare Network trial with varied machines, and we were assessing their ability to establish a spring sown multi-species in late November into a ryegrass pasture base. The photo on the left is a Vardostat disc drill going straight into that pasture. You can see a millet in about the middle of the photo and a tillage radish off to the right, but that's about it. So really very little establishment, and establishment failure is what I would term that. In the middle is the strip till machine, which is called the Soil Key Renovator, which is manufactured in Gippsland. This is a fairly low impact machine designed to be that way, and it sows in strips across the paddock and only cultivates about 17% of the pasture base or the paddock base. But you can see here it's established the multi-species, but they are having quite a bit of difficulty getting up and going with the competition from the pasture base. And this is several months after sowing, probably 3 months after sowing. In February, I took these photos. And then on the right-hand side, this is a power harrow, so a bit of a tried and tested method in southwest Victoria where our soils are quite heavy, and it did quite a good job going straight into the pasture base without any herbicide control. So obviously, depending on your soil type and the base pasture or whether you've been cropping, this scenario may change for you, but it's just an illustration that we need to pick, if we're doing cultivation without chemical, the level of cultivation strategically, particularly when we're starting off, to give us the best establishment results. There is on the Heytesbury District Landcare Network guide a cultivation guide that I've put together with a colleague of mine. It's available as a free PDF download, and if you wanted to check out that website and download that PDF, it may help you choose which level of cultivation you may require, particularly at the start of your journey. I think one of my favourite farmers, this is a photo from one of my favourite farmers. I think he's actually on this webinar at the moment. But this is the flip side of the coin if we choose chemical over cultivation. And this is just a request from me to show what can be achieved with chemical, particularly at the start of that transition phase, and using that chemical strategically. So I did ask my farmer in this instance to stop spraying at the tree, to stop spraying the Roundup control, and the whole paddock was direct drilled with the same multi-species mix. The only difference between the two outcomes is the fact that the right-hand side of the tree was sprayed with Roundup before the multi-species mix was direct drilled, and the other side of the tree was direct drilled without any chemical control. So this particular farmer, this was a new farm at the time, and this was the worst paddock on the farm with quite a lot of undesirable species as the pasture base, and the aim was to go into multi-species and to make this paddock more productive. It is a lighter soil type, so a minimal or no cultivation was preferred, so chemical was the preferred option here. But you can see the difference between the two, very stark. Obviously a success on the right-hand side and a failure on the left. So we need to be strategic, especially when we're starting off. This particular paddock is now not getting any chemical control when we're oversowing these multi-species after a few doses of Roundup, because that intervention has achieved the result of taking out all that undesirable pasture base that was there. So it's now a much stronger multi-species paddock without chemical intervention, but it took a little bit of time. So start off as aggressively as you need to with your chemical or your cultivation, and then aim to take that intervention level down or abolish it entirely over time. If you're grazing, if you have livestock in the system, short duration, high intensity grazing will help you get the most out of your mixes while providing the best soil health and environmental outcomes as well. So to boil it down in a couple of dot points, if you can manage it, and it has to work for you, but 1 to 3 days of feed in any given area with stock at a pretty high density. So small areas, large amounts of stock, a short time frame for them to be in that particular area, and then moving them on while there's 100% ground cover and quite a generous residual left. So we want some trampling effect with our livestock, and we probably want 1.5 to 2 tonne of residual left so that those plants really bounce back. And then we want really long rests, so anywhere from 60 to 150 days before we're back on that area again. So this is the type of grazing promoted by RCS, Alan Savory, etc. And if you can manage to get thereabouts with your grazing management around those couple of dot points, it will pay you back quite a lot. So there's a few different ways as to how it can pay you back. So the livestock production often improves. So as we lengthen the rotation, the plants bounce back more and there's more fodder in front of the livestock. So we're creating a feed wedge. So that's number one. But they also eat a more consistent diet. There's not the, because they're not cherry picking, if they're set stocked, they're not, and in comparison, they're not cherry picking species and going on a degrading plane of nutrition over time. If they're in this short duration, high intensity grazing phase, they are sort of pushed by their companions to eat quite quickly and to just grab everything in front of them. So they eat a much more consistent diet, and their production and plane of nutrition is much more stable over a longer period of time. They evenly graze, so our plant persistence improves. And when they're mobbed into small areas, they fertilise much more uniformly, so we get much more nutrient cycling in smaller areas. They have more cushion underneath their feet, and they have less need to walk around finding the next bite if we have that feed wedge in front of them. So there's a much greater improved persistence, especially of the multi-species mixes, because there is diversity in there that we want to retain. We find the persistence of all the species in the mix is much better if we do this type of crash grazing approach. And if we leave a generous residual for a long enough time, we get a much better regrowth potential as well. So the seasonal feed wedge often improves, and feed becomes cheaper because we're actually improving the amount of feed that we're growing on farm by not overgrazing. It also reduces root pruning and soil damage, and the plants are healthier and less stressed, so they end up needing less inputs in terms of fert and potentially herbicides to control weeds, because we're competing with the weeds with healthy plants. Our organic carbon improves because we've got more healthier plants that are photosynthesizing at a rapid rate, and that improves soil structure, water holding capacity, and nutrient cycling as well, as we've seen. And we often see input reductions of chemicals and fert, but also potentially of drenches and animal products, because they're on a better plane of nutrition, they're healthier, and they're not grazing close to the ground, so they're not picking up worms, etc. So there's a lot of ways as to how this grazing management can help you in the business and help you have an economic return from it. And once you start it, you probably won't go back. It is a really good system to that goes hand in hand with the multi-species if you have livestock in the system. So in terms of adopting multi-species, I do like to think of the adoption as a holistic approach. So do your research first, make sure you're teaming up as you are with Soils for Life, but also there's a lot of information in this space now, so make sure you're taking that in as much as you can. Transition gradually in most areas, so build the diversity and the multi-species of your system gradually. Start off small and slow. And if you're using synthetic ferts and inputs in the system, make sure you transition or wean off them slowly. Don't crash your system, so it will take time. If you can, and this is what I mean about the holistic approach, if you can make one management change, such as adopting multi-species, that's fantastic. But if you can make multiple system changes and think about your system holistically, then you will start to see really amazing compounded results. So, for example, if you adopt the multi-species and you also pop some biological stimulants on the seed and you change the grazing management of those multi-species if you have livestock in the system, you'll have a much greater impact than you would if you just adopted multi-species alone. So if you can start to adopt several regenerative changes, you will see optimized results and much more rapidly than otherwise. So that's about all from me. I'll just leave you with this slide for a couple of seconds, just and some references which you might find helpful in terms of books that I found helpful, but also some information that's on the web as well through various Lanka networks. So I'll leave that there, Courtney, for just a couple more seconds if we want to start taking some questions, and then I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I love that Dirt to Soil book. That's a goodie.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have a question from Ian Field. G'day, Jade. Yep. Thank you. Do you use the biological additives as seed coatings? Do you plant the seeds wet or once the seeds have dried, or do you spray on planting?
So there's a few different ways you can do it. So the when you're using it as a seed coat as such, the amount of liquid you're putting onto the seed is really minimal in terms of, say, that 5 or 10 litres to the tonne is normal for those types of products. So it dries almost instantly. It's not necessarily wet. So the rule of thumb is that you can sow almost immediately after you've biologically primed those seeds. You can also put them out as foliars, but then it's sort of 5 to 10 litres to the hectare. So it becomes a more expensive process if you're putting them out as foliar sprays. But there's undoubtedly efficiency benefits in terms of putting, especially if you take a tissue test and then you put out your foliars to suit, rather than putting out, granular fertilizer. Those foliars can be really efficient, applying those nutrients straight onto the leaf. So you can apply them, the biological stimulants, as foliars. There'll be an added cost comparing to using them as a seed coat, but they are quite efficient in terms of applying nutrients straight to the plant when they're needed. So both are possible, but certainly if you're going to start off, coating the seed is really, really cost effective and doesn't require a lot of gear. So that's where I'd start.
Thank you. Feel free to jump off mute, Ian, if you had a follow-up question. Ian's also asked if you could please post the link to the guide that you referenced.
Sure. Yep.
Jessica has asked, in a certified organic broadacre intercropping system, Jessica's in WA, what would be some multi-species combos that you would recommend to partner with cereals, primarily oats? This season, they've tried oats, tillage radish, Balanza paradana clover, and keen to build on that next season.
So good start with the clovers and the tillage radish. I really do like both. This is going to be a bit Victorian based, but vetch can sometimes be really good. It may not be applicable for you over in WA there, but it is a good climbing legume, and it can, particularly if you want to do or to have that flexibility to have multiple end uses, the vetch can be very helpful in terms of improving the quality of hay or silage. Or you can, because they're different seed sizes, you can sort them later if you're going to harvest them together. Tillage radish is a good one. Clovers are great. That's how I'd start. I think faba beans could potentially be an option as well, because the seed, they're quite an upright plant, and if they're applicable to your area, the seed size is massive. So seed sorting them would be relatively easy in comparison to a cereal. So there's a few you could potentially start off with as well. So again, more legumes, but vetch and beans could be a potential for you.
Let me know if you have anything else to say, Jessica. Ian has asked, what would you suggest as a possible mix for multi-species hay production? Are there ways to having all plants being ready for harvesting at the same time? Are you in dairy, Ian? Is that right? Or just a grazing operation?
Sorry, thank you. Can you? We're an oddity. We run cattle and goats for meat. We have a goat dairy, and we value add off farm. So a bit of both. And I'm also thinking of trying to do some cropping for us for feedstock. So our two main inputs on the farm are, I should look at the camera, not at you guys, are hay and some pellets. So we're looking to try and reduce our having to get those elsewhere. So bit of both.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. So in terms of hay, if you were to do a multi-species mix, you could tailor it to hay production. So either there's two ways to do it. So you could tweak the species mix so it's probably less brassica dominant because the brassicas, the stems are a bit difficult to dry out and they make rough hay. You can do that either by putting them into the mix at a much lower rate than a grazing mix, or you could graze off that hay mix if it was a longer maturity crop with your livestock, and they'll take out a lot of those brassicas and potentially make them shorter as well. So when you go in for hay, they won't be as big a component of the mix. So there's two ways of doing that. If you were to tweak it from the get-go in terms of seed, you could put in, if we're doing an autumn sowing, your cereals, potentially ryegrass, if that's not a swear word for you, but to some it is, to some it isn't. But cereals, ryegrass, your clovers, vetch, if that's applicable for your region, some field peas, linseed, just in terms of soil health. You probably won't pick it up in the hay, but it is a good plant to have in terms of soil health. And you could pop in your brassicas at a really low rate or omit them entirely. So you can still have quite a diverse mix, and that would go through for hay production quite easily.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
No worries, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Dougal has asked about herbicide, dropping herbicide rates. He said, canola is often a great tool for weed control. Therefore, when adding beans or peas, how much herbicide can or should we drop to get the benefits of multi-species?
So it depends if you need herbicide in crop or not. So can we have a bit of an elaboration on that?
Yeah, so I guess there'll be we're doing a trial this year, just 20 hectares side by side, and we sort of treated the bean canola crop as almost exactly the same as the canola. So the only difference in terms of simazine, insecticide, and all the usual things you might use for canola is the same. And we will be doing a few in-crop herbicides, mainly for ryegrass, I guess. And so I think one of the mistakes we might have made is we bought all these resistant, canola and bean varieties and spending a lot of money to control the same things we would be in a monoculture, and whether we should have just gone out and bought really cheap seed or even used our own seed that we harvested last year. And that way it's a really low cost, low risk crop compared to, again, high risk, and you just sort of continue to damage the soil with all the herbicides.
I'd investigate doing that next year, the lower cost option. You can buffer herbicides. So I'm the first to admit I'm not a chemical expert. I know the basics and that's about it. So in a livestock system, I deal mostly with Roundup. And we do buffer Roundup with, there's two ways of doing it. So, and both together are quite effective. So drop the pH with citric acid, so down to about 2.9. And then you can buffer the Roundup or drop it by about 30% by using fulvic acid. So that will allow the plants to uptake the herbicide more effectively, and it's also really good to reduce the detrimental effect on the soil biology. So Roundup, definitely you can drop the rate by about 30% in that way. Your other herbicides, I presume it's similar, but Roundup is what I'm most familiar with. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks, Dougal. Cole Freeman Hunter would love some more search terms. He hasn't been able to find the report on the AgX site.
Okay, yep, I can add the links. I'll send you the links, Courtney, to the cultivation guide and the report as well after this.
Yep. No worries, thank you. Jessica has another question. If designing a pasture for rotationally grazing laying hens, what species would you suggest? Southwest WA, 600 mil winter-dominated rainfall.
Okay, excellent, Jess. So hopefully that's kind of, you know, on a sort of face level quite similar to where I am. So I'm in about a 600 mil winter dominant rainfall area in Southwest Vic. It will be slightly different, of course, because you're in WA, but we use in the autumn cereals, legumes like clover and vetch, etc., some brassicas, and then a few things for soil health like linseed and maybe a little bit of buckwheat and stuff like that. I do have a farmer in a trial that was running laying hens as their business, and they found that those types of species, the hens were quite happy to browse on. So kind of your standard multi-species mixes that a seed supplier would potentially sell you will be quite good for your chickens. So if you're doing a summer mix, I would think sunflowers would be a good idea, millet, your buckwheat again, some of your brassicas, etc. So I think they'll forage quite well on those types of quite standard multi-species mixes.
Thank you, Jade. That's terrific. Just specifically, if I could, what brassicas?
So I tend to pick on tillage radish quite a lot because of its taproot. This is what you can see behind me. This is at home. It grows really vigorously, opens up heavier soils, adds a bit of bulk to lighter soils. So it's dual purpose kind of one. Attracts quite a lot of pollinators, so particularly bees and ladybirds. And it's really good forage quality and a really aggressive grower. So that would be the first annual brassica I'd use. You could also put in fodder rape and turnips. The good thing, I suppose, with your turnips and your tillage radish is they also have bulbs. So if the chickens get in and peck about, they'll take off the leaf and the flower, obviously to a certain extent, depending on how tall they are and how well they can fly. But they'll also peck in and around at the bulbs as well. So probably your tillage radish and your turnips might be good to try.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thanks, Jessica. Also, on the topic of diversity for grazing animals, I would recommend listening to our webinar with Dan Kittredge. He was sharing some really interesting research about the health benefits in terms of meat quality and then also the animal health when on diverse pastures. It was really fascinating. Rhonda has asked, has any work been done on observing weed reduction after the multi-species? Guess what? Ryegrass resistance? I guess, yeah, is she... Feel free to jump off mute, Rhonda.
Hi, Jade. Lovely to see you, and it's great.
Hi, Rhonda. How are you?
Great webinar. I think if we look at people who are combining commercial cropping with multi-species, as ourselves, and I think a lot of farmers that you're getting into turning the corner is that they will be still commercial cropping and add a multi-species. We've tried it this year, but we haven't monitored the results from a winter multi-species, roll, crimp, graze, resow it at Christmas time, multi-species, and now we've still got that feeding now, that after 2 multi-species, basically your ryegrass resistance is reduced. And I think it's probably huge for the integrated farmers where we're looking at they're going to be commercial cropping and cover and multi-species, that if we could get some trials around how much reduction, because ryegrass resistance is still huge and center stage basically.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rhonda. Anecdotally, I've seen a huge amount of reduced weed pressure with the multi-species, but I am not aware of a lot of trialling that's occurred in that area. Grant Sims talks a lot about it in his cropping enterprise in Northern Victoria as being one of the key benefits. Obviously, he's integrated livestock into that system back again, which is good, and he's seeing, you know, production benefits from that. But he's also seeing, as well as all the soil health benefits, a real reduction in weeds. But I don't know whether there's a huge amount of trials data out there on that. I'd like there to be. There may be results, but I haven't come across them in sort of my day-to-day looking. So I'll put that down as something to look for, but I'm not aware of it as a huge research space.
Possibly, yeah, it would have to be funded by someone more in this space because chemical companies wouldn't be funding it to reduce.
That's right.
Reduce ryegrass resistance. Thank you so much, Jade. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda.
If anyone has any references to add to that conversation, please feel free to share. Adam has asked, at what time would you recommend terminating multi-species plants out of a cash crop? For example, broadleaves out of a cereal to harvest the cereal.
It's always a tricky one. If you're grazing to terminate prior to growth stage 31 is great, so that you have time to lock them up. If you're spraying them out, you can probably leave them a little longer. So it depends which method you're doing to get to terminate them as such. But certainly before head emergence, I would say they'd have to be completely gone in both instances. But grazing, in order not to damage, particularly if you're going with a cereal as your main cash crop, in order not to damage your yield, you know, taking the stock out prior to growth stage 31 is usually the best outcome. And if you're grazing as your termination strategy and you have any stragglers, then you can just go over the top with a selective. But certainly grazing is earlier than herbicide control.
Thank you. Let me know if you have anything else to add, Adam. Sophie is interested in improving diversity in her interrow cover under walnut trees, currently mixed grass species and some clover. We harvest off the ground, so being able to achieve a smooth harvest surface in autumn is a key concern. They also run sheep. Her question is, what additional species would you suggest including and how to successfully introduce these in the established orchard pasture in southern Tasmania?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. There's a lot in that one. So establishment does depend a little bit on your soil type and what pasture base or grass base you have there already, whether it's very competitive or not. You may need to cultivate, particularly if you want a smooth bed between the walnuts. So some level of cultivation is probably going to be necessary. And then would you be able to come off mute? Would you like low growing species, or what were you looking for in between the walnuts?
Low growing species would probably be ideal. We can mow, but if they're very woody or stalky or anything clumping, then that makes it really difficult.
So probably if you're talking grass, I'd probably go with a fine leafed ryegrass, probably, because it doesn't clump like our cockswoods and fescues, etc.
Well, we've already got
even though the modern
fescue.
What was that? Sorry.
We already have tall fescue. That's the predominant species.
Right.
I don't know why that was chosen in the beginning, but
right.
that's what we've already got. But I'm looking for something that's a different family, so that we've got that diversity.
Okay, excellent. So you could, if you wanted lower growing stuff, particularly for an autumn sowing and where you are in Tassie, I'd pop in linseed. It's a fairly low growing plant. Quite a lot of clovers. Your vetch and peas will tendril up your fescue a little bit, particularly if it's a bit taller. But if not, they'll kind of sprawl on the ground. So they're not going to be, and they're quite lovely and soft in terms of their stems. So they're not going to be too difficult. The brassicas are probably a little bit difficult for you there if you don't want stems. So behind me, you can see that the tillage radish does get a bit stemmy. And if you will potentially mow it, but it can be a little bit stemmy. Although if you're mowing it, it's probably the least annoying brassica in terms of fodder rate can be stemmier, and your turnips will be quite bumpy in terms of mowing. So if you wanted to include a brassica, try the radish, but bearing in mind that it will get a bit taller and a bit stemmy.
Yep. So I'm a little bit stuck on how to establish. Still, you're saying some tillage.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Could you run me through your soil type? And so you've got fescue. Okay. How dominant is it? It's quite dominant, is it?
Quite dominant. Nothing's been done with this pasture for a really long time. So there's all sorts of things in there, but definitely predominantly fescue.
Okay. So, and you've got sheep?
Yes. Not all the time, but that's on stage. Yep.
Okay. Can you hard graze that fescue?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first step.
Okay.
You may need to mulch as well if they can't get it right down to the ground, but that would be the way to hopefully be able to sort of sow between. You may need to scruffle it up, depending how clumpy that fescue is, between the fescue clumps, if it's clumpy, to get a bit of a seed bed. You might be able to get away with speed discs, but you might have to go to a power harrow or something like that. So have you got a local contractor that you know that might come and give you that sort of specialised
Yeah,
local...
I can source. Someone to do that.
So I'd do that first. I can give you some recommendations as to what you might have to do, but if they're in your neck of the woods and looking at the area, that would be best. But in terms of if the fescue is dominant and it's a reasonable percentage of the pasture base, it will sort of outcompete or potentially compete with the multi-species that you're sowing. So hard grazing probably first, and then a level of probably speed discs or up in terms of intervention if the fescue is quite a big percentage of the plant pasture base. If it's not, you could probably get away with direct drilling over the top of it if the clumps are flat enough. But I would think you would probably have to do some level of cultivation first, but your contractor will have a better idea if he or she can look at the paddock.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thanks, Sophie. Jordan has 2 questions here, wanting to check whether linseed is toxic to livestock.
Sorry, go ahead, Courtney. I can answer that one first if the other one's not related.
Yeah, let's answer that first.
Yep. Okay. So yes, the answer is yes, linseed can be toxic, as can sorghum, and buckwheat can cause photosensitization. So there are species in the mixes. Well, the 2, linseed and buckwheat, are in there for soil health outcomes, but they're in at very low rates. So when I'm putting together a mix, linseed goes in at about 0.5 kilo to the hectare in usually it's autumn sown, so in a 60 kilo mix. So it's in at a very low rate and the stock will kind of ignore it. So unless it's blanketing your paddock, it shouldn't be an issue. The same thing with buckwheat. So sheep and white-faced cattle can photosensitize on buckwheat, but not if it's at a low rate in the mix. So I don't sow it in an autumn or summer mix at any more than 2 kilos to the hectare. And that's after talking to a few very knowledgeable people about its toxicity and its animal health effects. So as long as we're putting them in at very low rates, they will help from a soil health perspective. So we do put them in. To date, I haven't had any issues. The only farmer I know of, no issues with linseed whatsoever. The only issue I know of with buckwheat was a farmer, and I did advise him not to put the stock on if buckwheat was the only thing that germinated, but he did put the stock on and buckwheat was the only thing that germinated. So as long as it's not the dominant species in the paddock, there shouldn't be an issue, particularly if it's sown at 2 kilos and under.
And Jordan's other question, while we've got you, Jordan, is what options do we have in central New South Wales for amaranth species? So in Graham Sate's convo last night, he was suggesting that 5 species is kind of a good one to aim for.
So you can do 5 plant families. The Jenner grassland biodiversity experiment in Germany doesn't have any chenopods or amaranth species in their mixes, and they've been running their trials for about 20 years and they've had fantastic results. So if you can find a chenopod or an amaranth species, feel free to pop it in, but I don't think necessarily it's crucial. All my trials, I haven't yet had chenopods in the mixes, and they're doing quite well too. So on the other hand, if you can find one, you could put in spinach, quinoa. I know Grant Sims offers quinoa in his down undercover mixes as an option. And if you are unlucky enough to have some fat hen in the paddock, that will satisfy your chenopod requirement as well. So it depends what species you've got there, but certainly there's 2 commercial species available. And if you have a little bit of goosefoot in your paddock or fat hen, then you're fulfilling that requirement as well. It only has to be about 1% of the mix, apparently, to do good. So we're not looking for a large percentage.
So just to clarify, chenopods and amaranth, like amaranth is a chenopod, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
So Rob's question was if you could talk to the benefits of the inclusion of chenopods in multi-species mixes. What are the main benefits? And when summer, winter, should they be included? Just to follow up on that.
So spinach would be autumn sowing. Quinoa, I think it's summer, but I'm actually not sure. I haven't used it in mixes yet. But Grant Sims from Down Under Covers would have a better idea, but I think it's summer. As to the benefits, I don't know whether there's any literature available on the specific benefits of them as separate from the benefits of diversity, if that makes sense. So although quorum sensing and including 5 families rather than 4 could be beneficial, I don't know of any published data, not saying that there's not any, that really highlights the benefits of specifically including chenopods or not.
Jordan and Rob, feel free to add anything if you have anything to add. This might be our last question from Peter. Hi Jade, could you please suggest some seeding rates for different species in the cover crop mixes?
Yeah. Hi Peter. So we'll take an autumn example if we can. So your cereals, you can have one or several. So things like your barleys, oats, trit, rye corn, etc. Triticale. Sorry, I shouldn't have said trit. Triticale. Something like 2 or 3 of those, and 10 kilos a piece would be fine. So making your cereals 30 kilos. Your brassica, your tillage radish could be 2 or 3 kilos in the mix. If you're putting fodder rape or turnips in, they could be 1/4 to 1/2 kilo to 1 kilo. Linseeds, 1/2 kilo. Your ryegrass, if you want to put ryegrass in the mix, if you don't already have ryegrass in the paddock, could be 3 to 5 kilos, up to 7 if you want more ryegrass in the system. Clovers, 2 kilos a piece. You could put a couple of clovers in, 4 or 6 kilos of clovers is fine. If you wanted to use the more exotic annual legumes, vetch, peas, beans, probably 10 to 20 kilos. You could do 10 kilos of 1 or 2 of them, or 20 kilos of 1 of them. So that's kind of the basic wrap up. The autumn mixes in terms of sowing rate are much heavier than the summer mixes. So sort of 40 to 60 kilos is normal. If you were looking at a summer mix, you could put in millet at 5, tillage radish again at 2 or 3, sunnies at 2 kilos, buckwheat at 1 to 2 kilos. What else could you put in? Some clovers, red clovers, usually quite summer active, a couple of kilos. You could add some linseed as well at 1 kilo or 2 kilos. And sorghum and corn if you wanted to as well. So a summer mix is probably 20 kilos. I like to put in vetch in the southwest or southern Victoria as a summer option, as a summer legume. But if you were further north, you could try some tropical legumes. So we don't have much success down here with things like sun hemp and soybeans and cowpeas and mung beans, but you could have further success if you were in sort of northern Victoria or up into New South Wales or Queensland. So it depends a little bit, that those summer tropical legumes, on where you are.
Thank you. Peter, does that help you? Just to let you all know, Soils for Life are working on a practice guide on multi-species. So hopefully we can build on these conversations, and we'll be sharing some small case studies in that practice guide and some kind of decision-making frameworks around what species to consider trialing in your context and how to go about it. Thanks from Peter. Cheers. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Jade.